We are a bit behind in time, but that's not a problem, because what always happens if you're behind in time, we cut back from the break. Sorry. We will, okay, one announcement first, because there have been several changes, even last-minute changes to the program. You have received the updated program via email through Eventbrite, but also on each site at the, what is this material column, like these columns, you see a QR code on the left and to the right. If you scan that, you have the updated program. In the program, it says that we have the next panel now. I'm gonna ask my colleague Sheena Anderson to come on stage now. She will introduce our panel on climate justice. We will have until 12:20 for that panel, then 10 minutes for the coffee break instead of 30 minutes. But if you're in urgent need for caffeine, maybe quietly sneak out and get your coffee, and we'll do the panel on climate justice now, and I can't wait to have you on stage, Sheena.
Thank you so much, Christina. And yeah, I would now ask all of the panelists for the climate justice panel to slowly make your way to the front. And while you're doing that, I was also asked to repeat, or I think actually we haven't done that yet, say the housekeeping rules for today. So especially for all of our guests and participants joining us virtually, you can also ask questions to the panelists via the YouTube chat. And there was also a specific Slack channel developed for today where you can exchange, connect, network, and also, of course, discuss all of the topics that we here in person have the chance of discussing today. And just a reminder, if you have a question to a panelist and you're joining virtually, you can only post that question via the YouTube chat, not via the Slack channel. And one final note, while we at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy always appreciate people being critical, we would kindly remind you to always keep it respectful and in a kind manner. Thank you so much. Does this work? Yes. Yeah, well, thank you all for being here. I will introduce all of you in a second, and I will also introduce myself again in a second, but we will start with the opening remarks of Mitzi Jonelle, who is joining us virtually. Yes. Hi, Mitzi, nice to see you. And yeah, I will hand it over to you.
Hi everyone, it's so good to see you guys all together. It's really heartwarming to see it. I can hear myself speaking, so I'm gonna take my earphones off, so I won't be able to hear you guys while I'm speaking. Oh, there, it's gone now. Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Mitzi. I'm from the Philippines. I'm from Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, to be specific, and I organize with Fridays for Future MAPA, Most Affected Peoples and Areas, and Fridays for Future International. I'm sure at this point, many of us already know the facts, but let's say it again, because I feel like in the patriarchal, profit-oriented society we have today, there are things that we need to constantly repeat and remind people. So let's say them. Among those most vulnerable to the climate crisis are women and children, because during times of distress and emergency, it heightens the chances and risk for harassment and violence. 80% of the world's poor are women, and it's these women that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis as well. And again, 80% of people displaced by the climate crisis are women. And these statistics aren't even the best numbers because it doesn't factor in non-binary people, trans women, and other oppressed genders. And yet, these numbers are here, they're proven numbers. And yet, what are our experiences as young female climate activists, especially those from the Global South, especially those of women of color? In the Philippines, the Lieutenant General of the Philippine Army in the national newspaper said that young girls wearing short shorts, calling for the protection of the environment, are doing it to entice young men to join the rebel army and become terrorists. And that means that if they tag you as a terrorist, if the military tags you as a terrorist, you can be killed on the spot without any questions asked. And so young girls have been reduced to tools of enticement. Our calls for protection have been called acts of terrorism. And yet people still aren't seeing the importance of feminism when we're talking about climate justice. It's so important that we have gender justice tied into climate justice, because we see experiences like how in 2013 Typhoon Haiyan devastated the Philippines, and even months after, young girls and women were forced into prostitution because of the economic damages that was left in their towns and their cities. And that just shows that the climate crisis isn't just about extreme weather events. It's not just about the carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere. The crisis nature of the climate crisis especially comes from the historical and ongoing overexploitation of the global south by the global north, of the patriarchal society on women and other oppressed genders. And this is why gender justice needs to go hand in hand with climate justice. Our climate justice needs to be intersectional, because we cannot have climate justice without the other forms of justice. The climate crisis is amplified by other socioeconomic crises and gets amplified by and amplifies the other socioeconomic crises as well. And it's especially women of color who not only have to experience these discrimination against our thoughts and our positions, and we are belittled, but we're also threatened more. Environmental defenders and activists, women environmental defenders and activists especially, aren't just threatened with their lives. A lot of times, the government and the military and multinational companies use tactics like scaring their children, scaring the families, threatening the other people in the community, because they know that women who care so much about the community, who are the carers of the community, will be the ones who will be affected the most by these threats as well. And so that just goes to show why feminist foreign policy is also so important, so that we can protect our women, so that we can make sure that our women migrants also are protected, and there is an extra level of protection that is needed because of the existing patriarchal society that we're in. And so often gentleness and emotions and love and care, they're looked down upon and seen as, the bad characteristics of being a woman. That, oh, you're too emotional. To be a feminist, you have to be strong, and you have to be, angry all the time, and you can't cry. There are misconceptions about that until today. But my question is, why is that the misconception that's happening? Care and gentleness and community is something that's so important when we're talking about climate justice. These are traits that we have to embrace. These are traits of our mother. These are traits of the earth. And this is how we achieve climate justice, by embracing those soft parts, because that is how we inspire people to keep going despite all the horrible things happening in the world. To be a young feminist climate activist means to fight for the liberation of all, to fight for a world that lets us rest, that lets us embrace each other, that lets us love and care for each other without all these worries of our future and our present being threatened. And this will only happen if women across the world unite with all the different sectors of society, especially, again, the most marginalized women, our small farmers, our indigenous women, our small fisher women. These are the people that need to lead the feminist movement as well, because so often a lot of people, at least here in the Philippines, are so scared of the feminist movement because of how privileged it is, of how, the girl bossification almost of feminism, where, to be a feminist means to bring down men, and then that just isolates the small farmers and the workers who are men. That's not what feminism is about. Feminism is about justice for everyone, the liberation of everyone, being able to embrace that softness, but also knowing that there is a fierceness within each and every one of us, and using both of those qualities to demand for justice, to hold the multinational companies and the capitalists and the imperialist countries accountable. And so that is my challenge to everyone today, to constantly look for that gentleness in every situation, and hold on to that, and hold on to that care that you have for people, because that is how we achieve climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. And I don't know if you can hear us, but yeah, a lot of applause here for what you just said. And thank you so much for already combining all of these topics of gender, but also what it means being a marginalized feminist climate activist, and also the dangers that also come with that for some of us, and as you already outlined, what it looks like in the Philippines. So thank you so much, and thank you for joining us virtually. And now it is my opportunity, or my luck actually, to introduce the panel, and also welcome all of you here in the room, but everyone joining us virtually. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Sheena Anderson. I am a project manager at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, and I am responsible for our programs on anti-racism and on climate justice. That's why I'm sitting here. And I am privately also a climate activist with the Black Earth Collective, which is a BIPOC-led climate collective based here in Berlin. And at the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, we really do care about the climate crisis, or more so about intersectional climate justice. And for us, any feminist foreign policy has to care as much about the people and the planet and protect both. And in doing so, must always apply an intersectional feminist approach. And I'm just so glad that we have some of the leading climate activists, but also researchers and experts here today that teach us what that can look like each and every day. So thank you all for being here. And I will now introduce all of you, and I hope you forgive me, I need to check my notes once in a while so I don't forget anything important. And I will start on your left, my right, with Maria. Maria Reyes is a 20-year-old queer woman, eco-feminist, and climate and human rights activist, mostly with Fridays for Future MAPA from Mexico. Thank you so much for being here. And next to Maria, and also taking up that long journey here to Berlin from Mexico, is Miryam Vargas. Miryam is a Nahua woman from the Teutle region, also in Mexico, and she's a prompter of a communication for the defense of the territory, from there has accompanied the process of resistance and care of the territory in the Teutle Valley. Thank you so much, Maria. Sitting to my right is Tatu. Hey, Tatu is, and I'm very proud to have you here, also an activist with the Black Earth Collective here in Berlin. To my left, we have Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram. Dhanasree is a research fellow with the Center Mark Bloch, and also a guest researcher at the Freie Universität Berlin, and is specifically focusing on climate diplomacy, which we will also talk about on this panel today. And I would start with you right away, Maria. And you were representing or joined Fridays for Future MAPA, so most affected people in areas at the COP26 last November in Glasgow. And you demanded justice for mostly, or the people most marginalized and most affected by the climate crisis and the negative effects of the climate crisis. Can you explain what does intersectional climate justice for you look like?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question. And if you see me talking with Miryam, it's because I'm just translating for her. So I feel like that conception in itself, it's a bit repetitive, because for something to be just, it has to be intersectional. If it's not, then we need to check our perception of justice. So to start understanding, that conception, I feel like we need to understand what intersectionality stands for. And in my understanding, intersectionality is how the different identities that are part of us, like ethnicity, race, economic position, religious, political, ideas, all those identities intersect and create systems of either privilege or discrimination. So that's one first thing. After understanding that, I feel like something that it's very important, it's to remember that most of these identities that are also presented as vulnerable by the mainstream media and by many governments, if you sum them up, they are the majority of us. And that's how the term global majority is born, because they made us think that people of color, especially Black people, disabled people, queer people, some religious minorities, they made us think that we are minorities, but if you sum them up, we are not. And after understanding that, I also wanted to explain that how climate justice doesn't look like, because I feel like sometimes it's easier to understand it on that way. So we know that one of the main causes of climate change is the massive amount of polluting emissions that the fossil fuels industry had put in the atmosphere. And because of that, it's urgently necessary that we move away and transit to less polluting ways of generating energy. One of this is wind power. And that's something that it's being very present, especially in the south region of Mexico. It's like the states of Oaxaca, Chiapas, Campeche, Yucatan, like the peninsula we call it, almost the Caribbean side. So what happens is that when you install these wind turbines, of course that they don't emit like CO2, but that doesn't mean those energies are completely clean. Because to install them, you need to put them in land. And that land belongs to people. That land belongs to peasants. That land is the land that they use to feed their families, to feed their communities. It's land that was given to them by their ancestors, their indigenous ancestors. That land is culture. That land is spirituality for them. And when the government gets there, they don't ask you. The government and the private companies, they don't ask the communities if they want them or not. Maybe they're gonna fake that they asked. They either offer, okay, you can give us your land and we're gonna give you this very ridiculous amount of money like every year, or we just take it. And many people accept. And if they're lucky, they can use still certain parts of the land for agriculture. But if they're not, one of these wind turbines is gonna fall down and it's gonna spill a liquid that totally makes the land to be infertile. So they cannot use it for agriculture ever again. That is climate action, but it's not climate justice. And what are these wind turbines coming from? From transnational companies, mostly from the global north. So the governments in the global south have a big responsibility to stop, perpetuating this neocolonization behaviors, because they call it progress, bringing these wind turbines to our territories. But we call it neocolonialism. And you as people, as citizens from global north countries, especially the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, have a big responsibility to hold your leaders accountable. Why is it useful, for example, for advancing global climate justice, that Germany has a plan for net zero, for reducing their net emissions, if at the same time they are not regulating the emissions and the activities of the companies that are moving to our territories? You have Volkswagen here in Germany. I have it too, in our backgrounds, right in front of my neighborhood. And you have it in a showroom, showing how your cars are bringing this wealth to the country. I have it in the air that I breathe every day. I have it in the water that it's polluted, that I have drunk and had made me sick. The peasants in our territories have it in their lands when they are displaced so that the company can keep building, more industrial parks. So I just want you to think about that and think about how you have a responsibility with holding your leaders accountable. Why is it climate justice if it's only climate action in your territories?
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yeah, sorry. Thank you so much, Miryam, also for already pointing out how power and power structures and also privileges and responsibility play such a huge role in the climate debate and specifically the debate around climate justice. And that we all have a role here to play, and we all have responsibility here, especially people located in global North countries. And I would actually like to stick with this issue of power inequalities and power structures, and would pose my next question to you, Miryam, as we've already heard, and most of us know that on the one side, we have the most marginalized affected by the climate crisis, and we know that the climate crisis hits hardest where people already face inequality and discrimination. But then we know that on the other side, it's exactly these people that are actually leading the fight for climate justice and are actually driving all of these important discourses but barely ever get the recognition for it. So how can we truly listen to these activists and people, and how can we truly not only include them but give them the seat that they rightfully deserve at decision-making level?
That's for Miryam, right?
Yes. So for everyone else, we'll just have the translation here real quick, which will give you an opportunity to think of a question if you have one, either here in the room or also everyone joining virtually.
Entonces, pues son quienes han estado al frente de la lucha por la justicia climática en todo el mundo, sin recibir reconocimiento o ser consideradas socias en los niveles de toma de decisiones. ¿Cómo podemos apoyar las voces marginadas en el movimiento climático? ¿Y cómo podemos asegurarnos de que obtengan un asiento en las mesas de negociaciones y tomas de decisiones ambientales?
Bueno, muchas gracias por este espacio. Muchas gracias a quienes nos invitan en este día, en esta mañana. Gracias por la escucha. Y bueno, primero, pues decirles que en las comunidades no negociamos el medio ambiente, no negociamos la vida, sino cohabitamos con ella. Entonces, eso de entrada es para nosotros algo muy importante, porque a veces parece que nos sentamos a decidir por un lugar al que pertenecemos, pero que no es nuestro. Eso sería una visión patriarcal y también una forma de ver a la vida como una cosa o como un objeto.
Miryam started saying, like, thank you so much for being here, thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you so much for being here to listen. And she started by saying that in the communities, the indigenous communities, to start, they don't negotiate the environment. They don't negotiate the life. It's often perceived as they really need to take decisions on how to use the space where they are, but that's only a space where they are like living. It's not a space that belongs to them. Even when indigenous communities live in places where we consider as natural, it doesn't belong to them, because that will be a very patriarchal and supremacist, way of looking at it.
Los pueblos originarios, los pueblos indígenas, resguardamos el 80% de la biodiversidad en todo el planeta, pero este 80% nos está siendo arrebatado por las corporaciones como Volkswagen y la industria automotriz de Volkswagen, por ejemplo, aquí en Alemania, y la industria minera de Canadá, por ejemplo. Ahora que estamos aprovechando que estamos en esta embajada, denunciar a las corporaciones que están arrebatando nuestro territorio y que a las mujeres nos están dejando sin calidad de vida, sin derecho al medio ambiente, sin derecho a la tierra, a la salud, al agua y pues a una vida en comunidad, en paz.
Miryam said that indigenous people protect around 80% of worldwide biodiversity, but it's a biodiversity that's being taken away from them, especially from companies in Europe, like companies in Germany, especially Volkswagen, the automotive industry. But also, since we are in the Canadian embassy, we want to denounce that the Canadian companies carry out these minery projects in our territories, in the indigenous territories. So that this is a way that they are like taking away from them this, in these resources, they don't conceive it as resources, but these natural elements.
En todo el mundo, todos los días, mujeres están siendo perseguidas, asesinadas, encarceladas y hostigadas por los gobiernos y las corporaciones ante la defensa que ellas enfrentan y que ellas liderean en cada uno de sus territorios. Por eso el día de hoy queremos invitarles a que miren que la política exterior feminista pues está teniendo grandes fallas y una de ellas es que nosotras estamos teniendo que migrar a otros lugares para pues asegurar, resguardarnos de nuestros propios gobiernos y de las corporaciones que asedian nuestro territorio. El día de hoy yo soy una de ellas, estoy siendo hostigada en mi territorio por ser defensora del agua, de la tierra en la región cholulteca.
Miryam said that, she also said previously that because of these companies, taking away the biodiversity, especially indigenous women are being affected because of the social roles and the proximity that they have with nature. She said now that indigenous women are being harassed, disappear, criminalized, and murdered by governments and companies that are benefiting from this industrial projects. So she invites you today to look at this, to listen to that. She's here to denounce that feminist foreign policy, it's failing when indigenous women are displaced because of defending their territories. Today she is one of them. In her territories, in her territory, she is being harassed, she is being threatened, she is being criminalized for defending the land and defending the water.
¿Cómo vamos a crear una política exterior feminista si la política interior no es feminista, no es interseccional? La política en nuestros países, en nuestras naciones, aún no está eliminando y erradicando el patriarcado en cada uno de estos lugares en los que cohabitamos. Entonces, mientras que el patriarcado exista, mientras que los hombres no renuncien a sus privilegios y mientras que el capitalismo no renuncie a nuestros territorios y el extractivismo, vamos a continuar en una pirámide pues de privilegios, de grandes corporaciones y de grandes poderes que asedian pues la vida, la biodiversidad, no solo pues del medio ambiente, de la naturaleza, sino de la humanidad entera. Entonces, si queremos hacer y tener estos espacios en los que incluimos a las mujeres, pues de entrada tendríamos que mirar que las políticas al interior de las naciones tampoco están siendo incluyentes, tampoco están llamando a los pueblos originarios a dialogar sobre cómo habitar el territorio.
Miryam said that, how are we going to create a feminist foreign policy if inside our countries we don't have an intersectional feminist policy? If people are being harassed, if women are being harassed, are in danger inside the territories, inside the countries. Inside our countries, we don't have that. If if men are not willing to give up on your privileges, and the capitalist system is not willing to give up on our territories, then we're gonna keep building this, like system, like hierarchies of privileges that at the end, the only thing that do, it's continuing this exploitation and putting people in danger when it comes to defending what it's rightfully theirs.
Hoy mismo se está haciendo un gran esfuerzo porque yo esté aquí, pero muchas de mis ancestras no han podido estar en estos espacios y tampoco han podido decidir sobre su propio territorio. Han sido excluidas de diferentes espacios, han sido excluidas del diálogo, ni siquiera han sido escuchadas. Es más, muchas de ellas ni siquiera han sido vistas como personas, como seres humanos.
That today we are making, gathering lots of efforts so that she can be here, present and speaking. But her ancestors didn't have the same luck, didn't have the same story. Her ancestors' voices were not listened. Her ancestors' voices were not included when it came to taking decisions. So yeah.
Creo que el primer punto, el primer llamado para poder hacer partir de un momento, un punto de inclusión sería pues la justicia para quienes ya no están, como Berta Cáceres, como Betty Cariño, como Irma Galindo, que hoy mismo está desaparecida en México. Creo que un primer paso para el diálogo, para la inclusión, sería pues que se haga justicia por estas mujeres que han defendido el territorio y que hoy mismo ya no están aquí con nosotras, pues dándonos esta mirada importante de cómo cuidar la vida, cómo cuidar la tierra y cómo cohabitar de una manera más justa e incluyente.
The first step for advancing this is justice. Justice for women like Berta Cáceres, for women like Betty Cariño, for women like Irma Galindo, who is currently disappeared in Mexico, as she was a defender of forests. And yeah, that the justice for these women, for these peoples who have been like historically oppressed. And she also said previously that those voices like are the ones that need to be elevated. Justice for these people.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Miryam, and also for opening up and sharing all of this with us, which I am sure is not easy, and also shows that it's not only about caring about the climate and caring about the environment, but for some people, this fight is very personal, and it's about life, and it's about surviving or survival. And I personally think that's sometimes forgotten, so thank you for taking this long trip, for being here, but especially for opening up and sharing this very personal journey and experiences with us. Thank you. And I will now turn to you, Tatu, and maybe take a more German perspective on the climate debate and on the debate around climate justice here in Germany. And there was a time when Germany was celebrated as a climate champion. I think most of us would probably agree that time has passed. But what would you say is missing in specifically the German debate around climate justice? And now that we have a feminist foreign policy, and luckily we had our foreign minister speak to us this morning, and where do you see opportunities also to change now, and where can a German feminist foreign policy really be active in driving climate justice?
Thank you for the questions, Sheena. And yeah, I'm so honored to be here on this panel with these wonderful people. Yeah, great way to start the week, or midweek, yeah. But anyway, to have this week, and yeah, I just honor you so much for your work that you're doing at on the front line. And I think, yeah, everybody in this room should just pour out all the appreciation and love that we can possibly bring up, because you are making the difference and not just talking without having actual content and meaning behind it. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, what's missing in the German context? A lot. I think, and you had just started touching on this, I think in the Western world, in the global North, we, for this Eurocentric perspective that we take to things, so which in history has created binaries, so the gender binary, but also this binary of humans versus nature, that we don't belong together, that there's a clear divide. I think these are all justifications to suppress, so whatever is on the lower end of this binary, so be it women and non-binary people, be it nature, be it people of color. And so I think a mistake that has been made not only in environmental policies, but also in white environmental movements, is to always just focus very much on nature and not bring an intersectional social aspect to how we are all intertwined with nature. Because if we destroy this planet, we will not have anywhere to live. We cannot breathe or eat money. But that has still not arrived in some people's heads for a reason. So what we lack in the discourse that we have around environmental and climate justice is a lack of racism, of legal statuses, of people who come here because they have to flee their home areas. We do not address class enough. We're starting to talk more about sexism, but still not enough. And so I think if we don't talk about these aspects, we're never going to create adequate solutions to the problems we're facing, because our solutions will be based in ideas and ideologies that are based on capitalism, racism, colonialism, imperialism. So if we don't move away from this and learn from especially indigenous people who are taking care of biodiversity, we will never reach, we'll never create a world where we can all live together peacefully. So also in Germany, to maybe stick to race and class, because that's one of the focuses we take, or that I take a lot within the Black Earth Collective. We have no data on how Black people, people of the African diaspora, are affected from racist institutions and the racist systems that are in place in Germany. I think the Afro census, which came out last year for the first time, actually conducted a whole national survey on the lived experiences of Black people in Germany and how they're affected by discrimination on the labor market, racist housing policies, or racist or police brutality, and lack of access to healthcare. So that is something that has to be a big indicator, like, okay, there is something wrong here. How can we understand what's going on in these lived perspectives if we don't actually listen and want to acknowledge that something is wrong? A colleague and I, also from Black Earth, Ime Ituen, we conducted a first kind of survey called The Elephant in the Room, the lack of studies and empirical data on environmental racism in Germany. And so basically, we're so scared of this discussion on race in Germany. I don't know why, that it's so difficult to even just use the word racism and acknowledge that we are all racists. We're socialized in a racist way, and if we don't acknowledge that, we can never take the first step to become anti-racist and actually do something against this racist system that is in place. So just one brief example, and then what we use a lot, the word that we use is Migrationshintergrund or Migrationserfahrung now, but which means like migrational history. This cannot show the lived realities, because you can be a person with a migrational background, but you're not a racialized person. You can be white and migrate. That the one doesn't exclude the other. So even if a person from the UK migrates here who is white, they will not have the same difficulties and face the same discrimination like somebody coming here from Sudan, a black person coming from Sudan. So yeah, this is a place where we need to start having a discussion, because I don't believe that we can, and as it had been said before, we can't proclaim something outwards if we don't live it inside. And we need to live feminism inside Germany, first of all, before we can go outside and claim to be living it. So I think, yeah, to not take up too much space, I think we need to start addressing how bad the capitalist structure is in that we're living. That it's based on the exploitation of people of color, of biodiversity in the global South, and it is wanted that these systems of injustice stay in place, because if we would all be equal, quote unquote, we couldn't legitimize exploiting and destroying and letting people drown in the Mediterranean Sea and building up walls in Poland and only letting in good refugees, to quote, or not quote, but like to put it into different words that our mayor of Berlin did. And so I think, to be able to reach climate justice, we need to embrace class struggle. We need to embrace racial justice and all the other isms out there. But if we don't talk about them, then we're not going to move any step forward and just reproduce so-called solutions that are going to perpetuate. Even if they're green solutions, green capitalism is still going to exploit, especially Black, Brown, Indigenous, and women of color in the global South. So we shouldn't be fooled by these things. We need to take a hard look into the mirror, question ourselves, understand how we, and Sheena and me included, sorry, not to speak for you, but we as light-skinned Black Germans know that we also stand on the necks of our siblings in the global South, and it's time that white people in the global North start to understand this.
Thank you so much, and no worries, I agree, so it's fine. And yeah, so important what you pointed out, what's like missing in these debates, and I can only speak for myself, but it just made me so happy and relieved that in the panel that we heard before this one, but also the ambassador talking this morning, and whoever maybe joined us last night, that really intersectionality and moving forward from only focusing on women, but really focusing on all marginalized people, on all genders, on people who are racialized, that this is pointed out. It's a long time coming. I mean, I've lived all my life in Germany. This is the very first time I've heard people say this, and it just means a lot. So I'm just hopeful, and it's just great to hear all that. So hopefully we will see feminist foreign policies in the future focus even more on that. So yeah. And speaking of feminist foreign policies and what else has to happen in the climate discourse and the debate around climate justice, you, Dhanasree, do research and focus on climate diplomacy. Could you maybe explain your understanding of climate diplomacy, and why would you say, or why do you think that it's so important for any feminist foreign policy?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. And after listening to the conversations before me, and they have taken so many great examples to show why climate diplomacy requires a feminist lens as well. And I think that makes it very clear. But to just elaborate upon some of my own research, and also looking at why gender and the feminist lens is important for climate diplomacy, just look at the UNFCCC and the delegations that go to the UNFCCC, how many women are there, how many delegations are led by women. That itself is a story to tell, another story to tell, because that's very important. That's representation is just one part, but how much influence do these women wield when it comes to these delegations? And, just based on my own conversations with some of the delegates, especially women delegates who have been part of the UNFCCC negotiations on climate change, they say that when there are more women in the delegation, climate justice comes up more in the conversations as compared to when there are more men. And this is a telling story as well. This is something that is not discussed much. Why so? I think it's precisely these stories that and these experiences of women from the global south and the global north. I wouldn't say just from the global south, but even women in the global north who have been disproportionately affected by climate change, and not just in terms of the vulnerability, right? So we often talk about climate vulnerabilities and how women are disproportionately affected by climate change, but also in terms of the presence of women and other genders in the decision-making processes, there is a huge gap. Representation, and also in terms of how much influence do they have? Are the opinions and views and ideas of women valued in the decision-making processes? How much of it is integrated into decision-making? And we are talking about foreign policy, and majority of countries in the world still have a very, very parochial and conservative view of how foreign policy should be practiced, right? It's still something that is considered an elite subject. It's not something that is out for everyone to be part of. So those who are directly affected by climate change don't really have a say in what kind of investments come into a country when it comes to climate adaptation and mitigation. There is no say for the most marginalized and the most vulnerable populations when it comes to climate diplomacy. Right, so climate diplomacy is still something that the Prime Minister's office, the President's office, the Foreign Minister, the Environment Minister, or these are the people who still have the control over it, whereas the ones who are on the ground do not really have much of a say in how these decisions are made. And I think that's an important lesson as well, and that is why feminist foreign policy matters to climate diplomacy, because both in a way, so I studied international relations, and those who have studied international relations would know how gender or feminism has always been like this peripheral subject in international relations. It's like introduced in the end, like, this is also important to discuss. This is also one of the strands of international relations theory which we need to learn. And I think we need to change that mindset. So even if you look at the gender action plan that was introduced by the UNFCCC, why did it take like so long, like 2 decades, to even introduce this action plan? It was always there, but it was marginal. It was peripheral subject, right? So it was always there, but it was not acknowledged as something that is central to climate action. Like the previous speakers also mentioned, climate action, but not climate justice, right? So this is something that we need to also address. And just to give one example, about, maybe if we look at sectoral sort of understanding of climate action, agriculture is definitely one of the most affected sectors. And if you look at, countries in South Asia, which is where I come from, so when crops fail, for instance, usually it's the men who move out of the villages, they move to the urban centers. The women are left behind because they have to look after the families, they have to look after the fields, even if they're not yielding any crops. But yes, you need the women to be back home, and they're they have to fend for themselves. And very often these women don't have any land rights as well, so they don't have any access to the rights that they are supposed to have. And this is where, again, when you have climate-related disasters destroying, say, the agricultural sectors in the global south, what are the rights that women have in that respect? We still haven't defined them. So there is a lot of diplomatic initiatives, agricultural technologies that are being exported to developing countries without a gender lens, once again, without knowing how will the women use these technologies when informally they are a huge part of the agricultural sector. Just because they don't have the land rights, they're not recognized as farmers. So this is something that has to, of course, start from the bottom up, but from the top down as well. I think international organizations, all the major agreements that we have signed, like Paris Agreement, Sendai Framework, SDGs, all of them have gender lens, but how do we implement them on the ground is something that we still haven't. I don't think we have still gotten around some of these key questions to global governance. So that's something that we need to explore further. And I'll stop there so that I don't spend more time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dhanasree. And even that we're here at a panel in the Canadian Embassy talking about climate diplomacy, and as you said, I also studied international relations. I bet some of you too. I've never heard of climate diplomacy or anything during my studies, or also feminism was only discussed in 1 hour at the very end of the semester. So that we are here now able to talk about it, and people have kind of a common understanding of what this should look like, I think is already a major achievement. And I just hope we will have many more discussions on climate diplomacy and connected issues in the future. So thank you very much. I have so many more questions to all of you, but as always with amazing panels, we're running out of time, and I would really want to include people here in person, but also joining us virtually. So I would pick out a question here now, and you can choose whoever wants to speak to this question. So here's one. And I think, Tatu, you already mentioned it briefly. So how does the climate crisis affect migration and displacement patterns? So the connection between climate crisis and how it affects migration is, anyone wants to speak to that? And while we sort this out on stage, I see a question there. If we can get a microphone.
Shall I ask her right now?
Yes, we'll take them together.
Yes, thank you. My name is Leonie Hopkott. I work for the Greens in the Parliament. And I do have a question, thinking maybe more strategically on your work, especially Maria and Miryam, because you are such skilled advocates, of course, and international advocates. I wonder what your political and strategic focus is at the moment, and here comes the point with the climate diplomacy and how we actually implement the agreements that we have. So, for example, Germany, of course, has the presidency for the G7 summit this year, and Mexico is part of the G20. You've mentioned you were also at the COP last year. So I was just wondering which field you are kind of pushing forward at the moment, and where you think that the German government, German politics can support you and your cause the most, or most effectively, and in which way? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And we're still busy with the translation, so if any of you two maybe want to take up the question on migration.
Yeah,
Thank you.
on migration and displacement, it's very clear that climate change is already affecting mobility patterns. I just mentioned one example of how agrarian families are slowly moving away from rural areas to urban areas. There are lot of people who are migrating from, say, coastal areas to interior areas. I come from India, where the cyclone-affected areas are being deserted very slowly by coastal communities. But more importantly, there are other ways as well. There is forced displacement that is happening as well, where people can't afford to go back to their lands that they belong to anymore, because it's not feasible for them to go back to these lands. It's more vulnerable to these extreme weather events, or maybe it's just, because of, say, other factors as well, like for instance, saltwater intrusion. It's one of the major problems in coastal areas, where the drinking water availability is slowly just vanishing. So people have to then move to other areas. So in a big way, there is temporary migration. There is also permanent migration. There's also forced displacement, as I mentioned, when it comes to climate change. And also we have to bring in the conflict settings as well, where migration is it's like a vicious cycle, right? So you have climate change that affects conflict patterns, and you have conflict patterns which also worsen or weaken the governance structures, making it impossible for the governance structures to also function and provide services to the people, which also leads to migration. So it's not a direct sort of linkage with climate change, but it kind of interacts with the social, economic, political, and other factors to create that environment where people are forced to migrate, or they don't have a choice really to migrate. And here too, again, women are sometimes even more marginalized. Sometimes, more often than not, they don't have a choice at all, while men still can migrate to, say, urban cities, while women don't have that choice at all. So yes, even there, the gender lens becomes very important when we discuss migratory patterns. Yeah.
Bueno, en el caso de los pueblos organizados y articulados en la región cholulteca y también en el espacio de futuros indígenas, de donde la red en la que somos parte, María y yo, pues hay una serie de estrategias, entre las cuales la principal pues es fortalecer las asambleas comunitarias, que me parece que uno de los mejores ejemplos de cómo se incluye la opinión, el punto de vista y cómo se dialoga de cómo cohabitar el territorio. Esa es una principal estrategia, y hay una serie de estrategias más que se van articulando hacia el exterior, que tienen que ver con pues, campañas de visibilización sobre los efectos que están dejando las prácticas industriales en nuestros territorios. Eso creo que pues sería para nosotros muy importante que se visibilice en estos espacios. María.
Miryam said that in the case of the indigenous peoples in the Cholulteca region where she is from, and also the case of the Indigenous Futures Network, which is a collective that we are part of in Mexico. So we are in this process of making stronger like community assemblies, because community assemblies is a way that people have to organize and take decisions on a collective way. And of course that after that, there are like efforts and campaigns to visibilize and bring attention, like whether it's national, local, or international attention to issues that are happening on the regions.
Existe una forma en la que entre gobierno y pueblos se ha buscado pues mediar y dialogar respecto a el desarrollo territorial en cada uno de nuestros lugares, que es la consulta indígena. Pero estas consultas han sido pues mal aplicadas, y en la mayoría de los casos pues han sido violadas los principios fundamentales, como que las comunidades estén realmente y previamente informadas, que la consulta sea culturalmente adecuada, que la consulta pues sea libre. Y en este caso, cuando se haya llegado a consultar, pues las comunidades ni están previamente informadas, las consultas no son culturalmente adecuadas y se intimida a quienes van a participar en esa consulta, o se busca negociar previamente con dinero para que la gente pues termine votando a favor de los megaproyectos como el Proyecto Integral Morelos, como el mal llamado Tren Maya o como el proyecto del corredor transísmico.
She also said that a way that exists in Mexico for the government to like have a dialogue with indigenous peoples is the indigenous consultation, which is basically a process where like it's kind of very similar to like a votation process where there is a question and they have to like put a check mark whether they agree with something or no. But for an indigenous consultation to be carried out like properly, there are certain things that have to happen. For example, that the community needs to be informed that there's going to be a consultation and that the consultation had to be like culturally adequate for like the circumstances of the indigenous people and also of the mega project that it's being consulted. But it has happened many times that neither of both happen. Sometimes there's a consultation and people were not informed that there was going to be a consultation. Or people are threatened, offered money so that they vote, that they agree with a particular mega project. And that is the case of where the collective where she's part of. There is this mega project in the state of Morelos, and it's called the Integral Morelos Project. It's basically like a fossil fuels thermoelectric gas pipeline thing. Also the Mayan train, which is not Mayan at all, and several others.
Y bueno, en el caso de qué podría hacer, se podría hacer desde el gobierno alemán o desde el Estado alemán en nuestro país, pues podríamos pensar en una serie de políticas de reparación que se pueda generar un proceso participativo entre comunidades afectadas en su seguridad hídrica, pues en toda la región de Puebla, que es de las principales regiones afectadas por la Volkswagen, pero también nos ponemos a pensar y queremos compartirles con ustedes esta preocupación que creo que bien lo saben, cuando el agua se extrae, cuando el agua se envenena, se contamina, es difícil reparar ese daño. Cuando la vida muere, es difícil revivir la vida. Cuando alguien muere, no podemos resucitar a una persona. Entonces, la pregunta y el cuestionamiento y a la vez invitación es, ¿cómo podemos hacerle para dejar de asesinar la biodiversidad, la vida del planeta y sin necesidad de pues, buscar reparar después de que todo esto sea, de que hemos trabajado en nuestra propia extinción?
Yeah. She also said that when it comes to what can Germany do, what can the German politics do to collaborate, do something about this, is maybe we could think about a process between these people who are responsible for the destruction in the German government, in the German companies, and the communities on ground to have a reparation process, a process through which they can repair all the damage that they've done. However, there are things that cannot be repaired. You cannot repair when you kill someone. You cannot repair when you pollute water. There are things that when life is killed, it cannot be brought back to life. So how can we also think about a process, like more like a prevention, approach? How can we think of a process where we stop killing the biodiversity of indigenous peoples?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to answer to that question. And I think that something that you can also do from the international feminist foreign policy is to hold our governments accountable, especially those who call themselves feminist. All of you use Mexico as a referent, but in Mexico, 11 women are murdered every day because of gender-related causes. And I arrived to feminism since I was 12 years old because of my personal story. Feminism has been something that has saved my life. And I have never seen even a useful attempt from the national government or the local governments to do something about this. Usually the response that we have is to increase the security in the streets, which is increasing the police presence. And that is not useful at all. If I'm going back home, walking from my high school, because that happened to me many times, and I see a police car approaching, I don't feel safe. I feel scared, because they could kidnap me, rape me, and throw my corpse somewhere. And they have the power to make my name disappear. And they have done that a lot of times. Increasingly, the police presence, increasing militarization is not something that makes people safer. So that's one thing. Stop giving platforms to our governments and validating their empty speeches. Why is it useful for women and people socialized in women in Mexico that Mexico shows off in international conferences saying that they have a feminist foreign policy if every day, every time I arrive to school, I see my classmates crying in the restrooms because we have been harassed again?
Thank you so much, both of you, all of you. I will leave out my closing remarks and just leave that as closing remarks, that we should not forget the importance, and this was mentioned before, to always tie together that if we have a feminist foreign policy, we should also have a feminist government on the inside and live feminist values each and every day. So thank you so much, Maria, Miryam, Tatu, and Dhanasree for being here today. And thank you all for listening, for joining in and participating, and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.